Okay, hello everyone. So this week we are going to start looking at the foundations of the Roman Republic, and I'm calling it part one because there'll be three videos in this particular lecture, and I've subnamed it from myths or literature to archaeology. Um, this part number one, we're going to look at the myths of the very beginning of Roman history. Before I do that, I do want to have a little discussion on why Roman history is important today. Um, Mary Beard, so one of the books of our course is written by Mary Beard on Pompeii. She's written a ton on the history of Rome. And I should say, before I forget, she's also done a whole bunch of documentaries on Rome. So if you ever get a chance to watch her, she's fantastic. Anyway, she has a great book called SPQR, which is Latin for Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and People of Rome. And she does a really good job about summarizing why Roman history is important today and how it makes an impact. And she lists a number of different things, especially on page 15. One is the political geography of Europe was really determined by the Romans. We get our ideas of liberty and citizenship, along with imperialism, not such a, or I should say, such a terrible thing, um, from the Romans. It also comes from the Greeks as well, but a lot of that comes through the Romans. We get various words like senator, dictator. There's just a ton of different words that come down to us from the original Latin. We also have phrases that we use, bread and circuses, when you're talking about how governments are not giving people what they actually need. And we have that very famous saying called fiddling while Rome burns, which is attributed to Nero when Rome had a massive fire, which is outside of the course of our class. But we also have these idea of gladiators, probably one of the more famous things that people think of when they think of Rome. The ideas of roads. The Romans built a massive road system, which is one of the reasons why they were able to take over or conquer so many different areas. Aqueducts, which are used to bring water into the various cities. This is something borrowed from the Etruscans, and so on. And people actually know about Rome, which is really interesting. They know various bits and pieces of it. Not so much the Roman Republic, but definitely the Roman Empire. And I do want to add, I think they gave us the idea of diversity. Um, the Roman Republic expanded, and we'll talk about this in some detail, because of the way they allowed populations to become Romans. And I'm not going to spoil the surprise, but it was a pretty interesting thing for an ancient civilization to do. Okay, I made a brief lecture on this at the very beginning from week one. What we know and what we don't know. A lot of times it's what we don't know, but you have to put it together, which I think is kind of the fun part about being a historian. So I mentioned this before, nothing written down until about 200 BC, when in fact the founding of Rome, the traditional date of the founding is 753 BC. So 500 and some years have been separated from when it was supposedly founded to when people started writing it down. We do know that people were writing things down before this period. However, and I mentioned this, we get various bits and pieces mentioned in later writing. So that's usually taken out and you try and recreate what an earlier writer wrote about. And then, of course, there's a big issue with myth versus reality. So I mentioned we're going to look at some of the founding myths of the Roman Republic. And, as we're going through these, I want you to really think about what could be possibly real history versus, I don't know, reality probably isn't the best word here, but it's a word I'll use. And we'll in the next lecture, we'll look at some archaeology and see if we can tie in both the myth to archaeology. Okay, so we do have some written sources here that we'll use. And I'll show you some of these in just a minute. So we have someone named Livy, very famous. He wrote a book called From the Founding of the City. And then we don't have all of the books that he wrote, unfortunately, or chapters, I should say, in that particular book. But we do have quite a bit. In fact, this This is books one. Oh, I don't know if you can see this, probably not. This is book 1 through 5, and it's a fairly thick book. Um, and I've given you the dates. So we've got Virgil as well. He lived from 70 BC to 70 BC to 19 BC. He wrote the very famous Aeneid, which is a story, but we can pull some of the history out from that. And then we have Polybius, who wrote from about 200, or he lived from about 200 BC to about 118 BC. He wrote a book called the Histories. And again, we don't have all of it, but we do have enough to kind of recreate what we have here. And then this is a very famous part of a marble frieze that's based on the stories of Livy. And if you look down at the bottom, let me see if I can get a marker. So this character is the Father Tiber. So Tiber River is the river that flows through Rome. And then of course you've got the very famous image of the wolf suckling Romulus and Remus, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Okay, so I have some text here. Now, if I had been teaching this class in person, I would have um, shown this to the class and then walked around while people were reading it. Now, obviously, we can't do that in an online class. So what I'd like you to, excuse me, what I'd like you to do is to pause the video and read through this in just a second. So I just want to talk a little bit about this. This is coming from Livy, and what I've done is given you the places where you can find this if you want to read it on your own. So Livy 1:1 just means chapter 1, section 1. So if you get a hold of Livy, you can find it online. There's some really old, bad translations out there. It's usually better to look at some of the modern ones, like the one I use. It was published by Oxford. And then it's the same here. So Livy 1.4, it's Livy chapter 1, section 4. And this is the story about the founding of the city. And there are actually two stories, or actually there's a number of different stories here. One is that Livy starts off his foundation of the city talking about Aeneas, and I'll come back to this. I'm not going to bring this up right now, but they're kind of two separate but related stories about the founding of Rome. Okay, the one I do want to talk about is from Livy 1.4. Now, if you want to pause the video and then read through it, I will start talking in just a minute. Okay, so on the founding of Rome. So last week we looked at some archaeology and some remains of the Etruscans, the different people that were living in especially northern Italy. And then at some point, there were people living on these 7 hills of Rome, even though there are more than 7. But that's kind of the story. And when people were living much later, they were trying to figure out what their beginning story, their origin story was. And this is one of them. And Livy starts writing about these 2 kids, Romulus and Remus, and they were twins, and they were really set out to be exposed, which means to be killed. So they were put out, and the person who was kind of given the job of doing this decided not to do that. And what he did was he put them in a cradle that would float, and instead of putting them on the shore to be exposed, hoping that they would be saved at some point. And according to the story, a female wolf came down from the surrounding hills and started suckling them. And when someone came by, found this wolf taking care of the kids. And that's kind of the very beginning of the origin story of Rome with Romulus and Remus. And this is probably the most famous statue in antiquity. Now, it may not be totally from an early time period, but certainly this bronze she-wolf, they sometimes call her, is the kids might be added a little bit later, but this is showing Romulus and Remus feeding off this wolf. Okay, so go ahead and read this text. So pause the video and then I will start talking here. Okay, so now you've got Romulus and Remus who are growing up. they are starting to decide who's going to rule and where they're going to rule from. And the story, according to Livy, is that Romulus and Remus both picked a hill and they started to build walls around their particular hills. Now, who was going to be the actual king? Well, that was a big question. And so what you find in Rome, and you find this in ancient Greece too, that animals usually are the deciding factor. So the story goes, they usually have a priest who's standing there and they say, should we go to war? And then an eagle will fly by and it'll drop a snake. That's a typical thing that happens in a lot of these stories. So that when they were trying to decide who was going to be the main king, Remus first received an omen of 6 vultures appearing to him. And then Romulus, though, had 12. So they decided each was king, even though Romulus had the most. Now, this is where things get kind of ugly. So Remus decided he was going to argue with Romulus, and he jumped over the walls that Romulus had just put up. And his brother was furious, and he ended up killing Remus. And Romulus exclaimed, apparently, "So shall it henceforth with everyone who leaps over my walls," meaning anyone who invades Rome will get the same type of treatment. And then Romulus is declared the founder of the city. Now, you've got some issues here. So the story goes that as Rome was started off, there weren't a lot of people there. And so they made a call, and a bunch of men turned up. They were enslaved people who were poor, some rich people, but most of them were men. And so they needed a way to bring in women into this. And the story goes is that they decided to hold a festival and invited a group of Sabines, who are some people who are living close to where Rome was. And they invited them to this festival, but it was all a trick. So what happened is that when the men and their wives arrived and their daughters arrived, the Romulus and his friends put out a call and they kidnapped the women. And this is called either the rape or the abduction of the Sabine women. And I'll just want you to stop the video and read through this little bit of text from Livy 1:13. Okay, so what you're reading about here is these women were kidnapped. They are forcibly married to the Roman men, according to the story. And a little time lapsed, and the Sabine men decided they were going back to rescue these women. And so they arrived, and the men started fighting on both sides, and the Sabine women decided they were going to stand between them and said, "We are now married. If you want to take out your aggressions, take it out on us, but we are now really one people." And so the Romans and the Sabines set down their arms and they started to work together. Now, again, this is the story. This is the myth. We're not quite sure if this was actually true. Okay, now moving forward, in one of the other famous myths that come out of Livy and other writers is on the death of Romulus. So apparently there was a story that he was standing there and there was a giant thunderstorm, and in the middle of this particular storm, he disappears. And so Livy writes about how he was taken and became a god, one of the gods for the Romans. And as this is all happening, Romulus descends and he says to everyone, "Go tell the Romans that this is the will of heaven, that my Rome should be the head of all the world. Cultivate the arts, and then hand down the knowledge, so that no human can withstand the arms of Rome." So this is the founding story. So he has a twin brother who he kills. They capture a whole bunch of women. Now, there's a bunch of things happening too. Livy writes about more. I'm just bringing out a few of these stories. And then you've got the story about his death and becoming a god, and then leaving this statement, which has a really big impact on Rome in the future. Now, at the very beginning, I talked about a separate story or a different story that's kind of added on to what I just told you. So Livy makes note of it, and we also have a Roman writer named Virgil, and he wrote a book called the Aeneid. Now it's really interesting because it is another version, as I put here, of the foundation story. And what I did here is put a little notes here so that you can keep track of this, and I'll probably just read part of this. So if you're familiar with the Iliad, that is a Greek story about the Greeks who go to Troy and they invade the Trojans and they eventually win. It's a story with Achilles and more famous probably right now is Odysseus with the movie The Odyssey that's happening. Anyway, so the Greeks invade Troy. There's the Trojan horse where the Greeks built this horse. They left it out as a present to the Greeks. Sorry, the present to the Trojans. The Trojans take it into their city, and the Greeks invade Troy and burn it down. Now, in the process, a man named Aeneas escapes, or Aeneas. Now, what happens here in the story of the Aeneid is that Aeneas escapes with his father. They get in ships and they travel around the Mediterranean. They land in Africa, in Carthage. They meet an African queen named Dido, a Carthaginian queen, and she's very famous. And then they leave Africa and they sail and they land in Italy along the Tiber where Rome will be. And you already have a king there, and they meet and they decide that they're going to settle together. And then what happens is Aeneas has children, and they eventually come down to be Romulus and Remus. But it's an interesting story because, as I put up at the top, Aeneas escapes, he becomes a founder of Rome. Now, we haven't looked at this yet, but the Romans are going to take over the Greeks. So in the Iliad, it's the Greeks that win. They take over Troy. But in the end, according to Virgil, the Romans or the Trojans actually win because they will ultimately take over Greece. So it's a great book if you ever get a chance to read the Aeneid. And then moving on, so we have uh, a number of kings that are listed in some of these writings, and they're all, you don't need to worry about remembering these, but they're all given certain qualities that make up the Roman government, the Roman society, and so on. So for example, you've got a supposed king called Numa Pompilius. And I've given you the dates of when he was alive. And according to tradition, he created the public religious rituals and the priesthoods that the Romans practiced in their time. You've got Servius Tullius, who we'll talk about in just a bit. He gave citizenship to slaves and so on. So you have a lot of these stories about these kings that supposedly ruled Rome before the beginning of the Republic. Now, the last king we have is someone called Tarquinius Superbius, or Tarquin the Proud. Now, he comes to power in a very interesting way. So the king before him is King Tullius. And his daughter forces Tarquin, who will become the king, to kill her husband. And then she married him and then had her own father killed. And if you read Livy on this, she apparently takes her chariot and runs over her father's body. Anyway, so King Tarquin the Proud becomes the king of the Romans. Now, he becomes the last king because of another story, probably myth, called the Rape of Lucretia. And I just want to set the stage for this story because there's a few character names. You've got a man named Sextus Tarquinius, and he is the son of the king. So Tarquinius the Proud. So he's the son of the king. You have his good friend Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. And he was the husband of Lucretia. And so what happens is Lucius, or really they call him Collatinus, and Sextus Tarquinius were out having a good time, and they decided to talk about their wives and who might be the best wife of both of them. And they said, well, we can decide, let's go secretly and spy on our wives to see what they're up to. So we don't hear about Sextus Tarquinius' wife, but we do hear about Lucretia. So apparently they snuck up on Lucretia, looked through the windows or whatever it was, and she was sitting there spinning wool with her maidens, her servants. Um, and she was decided that she was the best wife of all. Now, Sextus Tarquinius apparently looked at her and really wanted her in a sexual way. And so what happened is, unbeknownst to Lucretia and Collatinus, they invited Sextus Tarquinius to spend the night when Collatinus was away, which is a typical thing you would do for someone who's traveling. Anyway, so according to the story, Sextus Tarquinius went into Lucretia's room and held a knife to her throat, um, told her that he was going to rape her, and if she refused him, he was going to kill her and kill a servant or a slave, and then he was going to put the two bodies in the same bed, which would be pretty awful for Lucretia's reputation. So anyway, he raped her. Now, the next day, she sends, soon after that, she sends a message to both her father and her husband to come back home as soon as they possibly could. So they did, and Collatinus brings a friend named Lucius Junius Brutus. Now, Brutus is a name that we will come across again towards the end of our class, and it's in the same family. So Lucretia tells her father and Brutus and Collatinus the story of what happened. They recognize she was not at fault, but she wants to preserve her reputation, and she pulls a knife out of her cloak and she stabs herself and she kills herself because of this horrible thing that had happened to her. Now, this is part of the story. I've given you here the full section of Livy. It's book 1, chapters 57 through 60. But this particular part that I show on the screen is section 59. So if you want to just stop the video, and then I'll talk about this in just a bit. Okay, as you can read, Brutus plays a really big part in this. He pulls the knife from her wound, and he says he is going to save her reputation. And so what they end up doing is throwing out Tarquinius Superbius. Sorry, there's a typo there. That should be Superbius, I-U-S, and driving out the king. And he vowed there would never be kings in Rome ever after that. And that was the case, although it's interesting because you end up getting an emperor, but they never called the emperor a king. Anyway, we'll get to that towards the end of the class. And then you've got Livy 160. You can certainly stop the video. And you can see what happened right after Tarquinius Superbius was tossed out. His son escaped, but he was killed later, according to Livy, when people found out what he ended up doing. You then have the sort of the creation of the first Roman Republic government, which is 2 consuls or 2 people who were elected to run the city. And we'll talk a little bit more about the government in a few weeks. Okay, now a couple things to think about in these stories that I just told you. And I put highlights here in quotes because they're certainly not highlights. I couldn't think of a different word to put here. But at the very beginning of Rome, you've got fratricide, or the killing of brothers. And on the other hand, you've got this idea of protection of Rome. If you remember what Romulus said, no one is going to jump my walls, and he leaves a statement about how no one will stand in the way of the growth of Rome. You have multiple stories about rape of women, and you've got the rape or abduction of the Sabine women. And if you remember, when I was telling you that story, it's the women who talk to the men, talk them down from starting a big war. And of course, you have the idea of the rape of Lucretia, that she's very virtuous. She was the best of the wives because she was sitting there taking care of her household. And she kills herself to maintain her her virtuous position. You also have this idea of this mysterious disappearance of Romulus and the handing down of knowledge, including the idea of fighting. Rome was going to be a fighting people. And then finally, the story I just told you, there would be never kings in Rome. But on the other hand, we know that there's an emperor at the end of the Republic, and it starts the Roman Empire run by a single person who's sometimes like a king, but the Romans never recognized the emperors as king. Okay, finally, last slide. So what do these mean for studying Roman history? I find these really interesting. When I told you, there's a big time difference between the time of all of this happening and the time of, say, Livy writing. You have to wonder how these stories were passed on. It's something called, some of these foundation stories are called conservative, meaning they don't change very much. And then enough people know them that if you do change something, people are going to argue with you. Nope, that's not the way it was. And then they'll correct it. So I think over time, you get this very conservative story or stories that probably were passed down. A lot of times, though, they are used as a way to explain what's happening in the present. So virtuous women fighting with Rome, or people fighting with Rome and so on. It could be explaining what's happening now and kind of reflecting back on what was happening, what possibly happening at the very beginning. One thing too, and we're not going to talk about this very much until we get to the end of the course, we talk a little bit about the Aeneid. So it turns out that Aeneas, according to Virgil, was related to the very first emperor Augustus. So Aeneas travels throughout the Mediterranean, founds Rome. His sons start Rome, and then their great grandchild becomes the founder of the Roman Empire as an emperor. So it's interesting that it's kind of, propping up is probably not quite the right word, but it does add credence to Emperor Augustus's power. Can we trust them? Well, that's a good question. It's, as I said, they're conservative stories. They're passed on throughout the generations. We can probably trust that a lot of the social morals that the Romans had during the Republic were probably based on these stories. We will look at archaeology next and try and figure out if we can correspond what's happening with these particular myths or stories and what is seen in archaeology.